Chapter 3. Accessing the Mirror. The Hermitage was a 3-story building, tall and narrow with a small porch in front of the main entry and a small garage to the left. Around it, the house had a fenced garden. The fence at the back separated it from the much larger Caddick Academy Park. Ulrich, Odd, and Richard arrived at the front gate together. The other children were already there, waiting for them seated in a swing that also served as a settee. They had all come, Jeremy, Aelita, Eva, and Yumi, holding Kiwi in her arms. Odd saw his dog, though he gave no sign of recognizing him, and the little puppy growled at him, suspicious. But this only lasted an instant. The teen ran towards him, and Kiwi began to bark, overly excited, licking his face like he did with everyone. Kiwi was still injured, and his body was covered in bandages. According to Jeremy, 2 large dogs had attacked him, the same ones who always accompanied the man with the red pickup, who had attacked Odd's father and Yumi's parents. Ulrich approached Yumi and put his arm around her shoulders. "It was nice of you to bring him." "Actually," she responded, blushing, "I had to do it. Haruki went out with her mom today, and Kiwi wouldn't stop complaining." "Well, other than that, you gave Odd a nice surprise." "What do you say?" exclaimed Jeremy, who until now had been talking to Aelita some distance away from the group. "We cut the chit-chat and get to work. We have a whole virtual world to explore." During this time, Richard hadn't stopped looking around him for one instant, distracted like a child with sweets in sight, but who was afraid of getting in trouble with mother and father. Ulrich almost found this touching. He was 10 years older than them, much taller and with completely uncombed red hair, but he seemed so shy. "Is everything okay?" he asked him. Richard nodded, but then shook his head. "I think one of us should stay here in the garden, to keep watch in case someone comes." "Well, but who would come here?" Jeremy mocked. "Well, I think it's a good idea," Aelita replied, approaching Richard and placing a hand on his shoulder. "The man with dogs could still be hanging around, and I would feel a lot safer knowing someone was out here keeping their eyes peeled." Richard Dupuy's face brightened with an ample smile. Lone Wolf had been right. Hannibal Mago had brought an entire army with him. Walter and his companions remained in their position, watching the long lines of men and vehicles disembark from their plane. Soldiers in camouflage uniform with semi-automatic pistols, faces hidden by helmets and gas masks, and 5 trucks, 2 open ones transporting troops and 3 carrying crates and equipment. "This is crazy," said Walter. "How are they going to move around the city with all these weapons and camouflage paint vehicles? It's as if they want to invade France." "He managed to land a military plane at a public airport," breathed Lone Wolf. "Do you realize how much that must have cost him? This guy has enough money to go wherever he wants." "And there's Mago in person," Weasel announced. Walter held the binoculars back up again. At that moment, a white, open-roofed Jeep descended from the plane, driven by a woman around 40 years old with striking red hair. At her side was a man of unidentifiable age with his face partially hidden by a wide-brimmed purple hat. He was dressed in a suit and tie, both purple, and on his hands, resting on the dashboard, shone dozens of rings. "Looks like a gangster with a fancy tailor," Walter commented. "Did you hear that, Wolf?" Fer said after bursting out laughing. "A fancy gangster!" Grigory Nictopoulos' pickup approached the Jeep and the man stepped out, closely followed by 2 Rottweilers with pitch-black coats. He and Mago exchanged brief nods. "Get back to the car," hissed Lone Wolf. "They're about to head out." The group moved like a rigid snake around the perimeter of the airport, and after several seconds the men in black sedan appeared behind them. Walter sat in front with Lone Wolf and nervously fiddled with a seatbelt. He carried a gun underneath his jacket, and there was an army moving in front of them. He wasn't suited to this kind of thing. Mago's soldiers had hidden their weapons under a fake bottom in the trunks, and they were now looking around, joking with one another, hissing and gesturing at the pretty girls they saw on the roads. Walter had never seen such frightened grimaces in his life. "Where are they going?" he asked. "I haven't the slightest idea," Lone Wolf responded. "The only one who knew anything about any of this was you, and you lost your memory 10 years ago." "Maybe they're heading for the Hermitage," Walter murmured. This name provoked anxiety within him. He remembered the somewhat gloomy chalet. He had been there many times, but when and why? Mago's Jeep, at the head of the strange fleet of vehicles, drove onto a narrow street between 2 rows of buildings and stopped at the end of it, where there was a high wall made of bricks. On Mago's order, 10 men armed with pickaxes got out of the first truck and began to work away at the wall. "I know this place!" Walter cried suddenly. "Caddick Academy is near here, and the Hermitage, and... Do you know what's on the other side of this wall?" Walter nodded as his head turned. It was as if he had been the same way a million times during his life, but everything was enveloped in a dense white cloud like cream. "There's a road," he stammered. "It has been closed off for a long time, and beyond the road there's a fence, and then a bridge and a factory on an island right in the middle of the river." Lone Wolf scratched his head, pensive. "A hidden abandoned factory, and Caddick Academy right beside it. It's like a full circle, and I'm sure that we'll find Hopper right in the middle of all this." "The school, the factory, and the house form a sort of triangle," Walter burst out, shifting in his seat, "and I get the feeling that there's something important in the Hermitage." The boss of the men in black smiled. Dita was sure that you could help us. Now, I'll tell you what we're going to do. My men and I will get out there and watch Mega, while you take the car and go to the Hermitage to secure the perimeter. And that means cutting the electricity and telephone wires and checking that there's no one in the house. If there are intruders, neutralize them. And then, call me. If I don't respond, get in contact with Dita straight away and tell her that we have a problem. Understood? Walter felt a bead of sweat slide down his forehead and stop, suspended on the tip of his nose. Understood, he whispered. The Hermitage's semi-basement covered the entire floor space of the house and the garage. Higher up in the walls was a row of windows, low but large, through which little light filtered through the dust covering the glass. At the end of the main hallway was a closed door that led to the underground passage allowing access to the sewers, and from there, Caddick and the supercomputer factory. Jeremy led the group through piles of more or less damp old junk to the cold room, an ample cement room closed by a thick, large metallic door. Thanks to a series of open holes in these walls, the room could be refrigerated to store meat, vegetables, and other perishable foods. But this was not the most important thing about this room, and the children had taken a long time to discover what was. Come on, Jeremy exclaimed. Let's open the door. Oric and Yumi immediately set to work. First, the boy hoisted himself onto a row of hooks for hanging ham on and pulled it down. The girl went to another hook and pushed it up. Meanwhile, Jeremy closed, opened, and closed the door of the room. The expectant silence that followed was suddenly interrupted by a metallic sound and a grinding noise. After this, part of the wall was raised, revealing a small door. Me first! Cried Odd, raising a hand to the sky. Richard Dupuis wrapped his coat tightly around himself and sat beneath a tree. He realized too late that the ground was soft and muddy and the back of his pants became covered in mud. He huffed as he sat comfortably. At least he couldn't get himself any dirtier. You should have gone inside with the others, he told himself. That much was true, but he hadn't had the courage. The teens didn't understand it. They were too young and energetic for it, but him, all that surpassed him, quite simply. Richard was 23 years old. He went to university, and it wasn't long before he would receive his diploma in engineering. His life was peaceful and planned out, with equations to solve and projects to complete, and then everything had changed. His palm computer had begun to fill itself with unknown codes, and he had needed to return to his old city, to his old school. He had found one of his old best friends, where he had lived 10 years earlier, and he had realized that Alita seemed to be 13 years old. He discovered the existence of a virtual world into which people could really enter, and where artificial monsters had decided to take over the world. And after that, there were the men with Rottweilers, and the secret government agents, and many more things. A whole crazy story. And now he had to go into the basement of a ruined house to see his ex-best friend dematerialize into a science fiction supercomputer? No thanks. Now all he had left to do was go mad. Richard took his palm computer out of his pocket and began to revise the various pages codes for the umpteenth time. Jeremy said that they were in a programming language invented by Professor Hopper. Richard decided that the boy was right. It was a machine language, and a very complicated one to decode, but the sound of tires made him jump. He leapt to his feet and instinctively hid behind the trunk of a tree. The dark sedan had traversed the roads at full speed to then slow down in front of the Hermitage, leaving 2 dark tracks in the bitumen. A man around 50 years old with very short hair got out. He was dressed in a black suit and tie and black sunglasses and wore a preoccupied expression on his face. Richard saw him approach the gate and muse about something. The young man tried to beat him inside. He ran towards the garage, still staying behind the trees so as not to be seen. He had to raise the alarm immediately. Jeremy opened the door of the scanner column, allowing everyone to see a narrow circular space that was completely empty. Odd had disappeared. The boy sat in front of the terminal again. A perfect transfer, he announced. Odd is in the virtual world of the mirror. He heard the rest of the teens pile up behind him to take a look. The computer screen showed Odd's face, although it was very different now. He had symmetrical mauve-colored stripes on his cheeks and forehead, and 2 cat ears sticking out from his hair. He had taken the appearance of the cat boy he always looked like on the Yoko. Can you hear me? Jeremy asked him, taking the terminal microphone. Loud and clear, his friend's voice crackled through the speakers. But Alita told me that I'd find myself in a sort of plaza with 3 trees, but I don't see anything like that here. I'm on a road in a city. Jeremy nodded. The 3 trees were a simple menu to access the different levels in the mirror, so I bypassed them and sent you directly to your destination. You'll need to explore the area a bit to understand how this level of the journal works. Got it, Odd smiled. Send Alita and Yumi, and we'll get to it. Jeremy leaned back from the computer's keyboard and ran a hand through his hair. Yumi, it's your turn. Enter the column. You're number 2. The girl squeezed Oric's hand gently in a silent goodbye. Let's go, she then smiled. I don't want to leave Odd alone for too long. Who knows what kind of trouble he could get himself into otherwise. After closing the car door with a yank, Walter tried to loosen his tie, tight around his neck, but he hadn't succeeded. His fingers were trembling too much. He was there, in front of the house. To him it seemed like a vision right out of one of his nightmares, and for a moment he was happy he was armed. Pushing it to the back of his mind, he gently pulled the gate towards him, applying pressure to raise it a little. The old lock protested and opened with a click, giving him no need to force it open. His brain may have lost memories, but his body knew this place, and he knew how to get around it. The man took large steps towards one side of the house. The rusted iron box on the garage wall immediately drew his attention, and he smiled. It was the fuse box. He opened it quickly, took pliers out from his interior pocket, and began to cut cables left and right. Aelita opened the scanner door, revealing an empty space. "Yumi has also been transferred," Jeremy exclaimed, eyes riveted on his computer screen. "Go on, Aelita, you're the last of the team." The girl nodded, hesitated a moment, and eventually entered. The sliding door closed behind her, and the bright light coming from the scanner ceiling gushed around her. "Get ready," Jeremy said. His voice came from the speakers inside the column and seemed distorted and metallic. Aelita closed her eyes. She was on the verge of entering the second level of her father's journal. Maybe she would find the answers she was looking for within it. When she accessed a virtual world, the scanner released jets of air that made her levitate, raising her feet from the ground, her hair flying up like arrows and her whole body softly tingling. But none of that was happening now. Lita opened her eyes again. It was dark, but she was still inside the column. "What happened?" she cried, starting to bang against the scanner walls. It smelled burnt, and a dense smoke crept into her lungs, making her cough incessantly. Jeremy rifled anxiously in his pockets, took out his phone, and pressed some buttons. The small screen lit up, brightening the room, which had suddenly plunged into total darkness. "Come on," he said. "Use your phones to give us a little light." "What happened?" Ulrich asked. "The power's been cut. The scanner's processors are fried, and the column is filling with smoke," Jeremy cried, his anxiety lining his voice. "We need to get Aelita out of there now." Ulrich gestured to Eva, and the two ran out of the room, using their phones as torches. Several minutes later, they returned with a large shovel. Ulrich slotted the iron part of the shovel in the crack between the scanner doors and began to push against the wooden handle. It's full of smoke in here," their friend's cry came from within the column. "Help me!" The metal door yielded in one blow, and Aelita fell out with her hands over her mouth and nose. Jeremy immediately approached her and took her in his arms. "What happened?" the girl asked, confused. "We don't know. There was a blackout and the system short-circuited." Jeremy felt his temples palpitate. He was afraid. If the power had been cut but a moment later, right in the middle of Aelita's transfer into the mirror, she would have disappeared into nothing, lost in a broken digital flux. Ulrich grabbed his friend by the shoulders. His pupils were completely dilated to adapt to the meager light of the phones. "Yumi and Odd," he cried in despair. "What happened to them? What?" "Don't worry, they're fine. The mirror is a sort of sandbox inside the factory supercomputer, remember?" Jeremy soothed them. "They're safe and sound inside the virtual world." He reflected for a moment and adjusted his glasses on his nose before continuing. "The only problem is that now we can't get them out of there. The scanner is out of order." "And if something happens to them while they're inside?" Aelita asked. "And if they encounter a monster?" Jeremy didn't respond. It was better to not think about this possibility. At any rate, for the moment, there was nothing they could do. Immediately after, the children jumped. Noises, footsteps in the basement hallway, someone stumbling and falling, grumbling in a low voice. Richard. Jeremy and Ulrich left the secret room and illuminated the young man. He had a terrified expression on his face. "Someone came," Richard warned them. "A man completely dressed in black. He cut the light cables and did weird things outside. He's coming this way now." Jeremy looked at Ulrich, and in his eyes saw the same thought as the one running around his own head. The men in black had found the Hermitage.